speakers who I think, great, thanks, who represent, I think, a genuine difference of opinion on this topic. And so to start off with Peggy, Peggy is a distinguished professor of philosophy and adjunct professor of internal medicine um, at the program in medical ethics and humanities at the University of Utah. Professor Battin's areas of expertise include medical assistance in dying, end-of-life decision-making, and contraception. And Peggy, I think, is probably best. I should say Margaret is best introduced as I think one of the foremost articulate and I think intelligent kind of and very rigorous defenders of uh, these topics of euthanasia and assisted suicide, voluntary euthanasia, assisted suicide. And we can say is in particular, like to kind of be fair with the language as well, medical assistance in dying is for several decades now. Peggy has been one of the most articulate defenders of a legal right to medical aid in dying. So I think I'll let Peggy herself maybe kind of add in a couple of things if I've sort of missed those. But I just wanted to stress that we're very lucky to have Peggy with us, Margaret with us today. And then I'll also introduce Kristin Collier, who is an associate professor at the University of Michigan Medical School, where she completed her internal medicine residency, and also chief medical resident year at the University of Michigan Health System. She is a doctor who is also the director of the University of Michigan Medical School program on health, spirituality, and religion. And she has written at length on preventative medicine, primary care, depression, and heart disease, as well as this topic of spirituality, religion, and health. And Kristin, I think, is a very extensive contributor to public discussion on a lot of these topics, such as euthanasia, which we're discussing this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you are. And she has also, I think, a strong social media presence, and I can attest as well, has talked at several conferences on topics related to euthanasia or medical aid in dying, and has given a really good, I think, like articulation of various reasons why someone, particularly kind of with a Christian perspective, might have reservations about legal access to euthanasia and medical aid in dying. So, okay, without further ado, I've introduced the two speakers. I'm going to hand over to the speakers to show some slides about what we agree on, I think, and then I think opening remarks. Now, Peggy, sorry, Margaret, could you remind me what would you like me to show the slides, or I just wanted to double check you've got ability to show them if you'd like to do that.
If you can see this face page that says Debate Society for Christian Bioethics, it says
I can see it, yeah.
You can see it, and the audience can see it. And by the way, Peggy is a nickname for Margaret, so calling me either one is just fine.
Okay, sorry about that. Just wasn't sure. Thanks very much.
That's Kristin on one side and me on the other. We've met in person a while ago, and we know we have a lot to talk about. So we want to start with some things that we agree on. Now, come on. Let's start where we agree, right? Well, here's the situation in the US. Here are the states where this practice is now legal. And all of them have statutes except for Montana. That's a Supreme Court decision. And there are many more undergoing considerable political machinations. I think Kristin will talk about this a little bit. This is not just the US. There are about 14 countries, and there's lots of motion in other countries. The Netherlands was the first of these. but Belgium, Canada is now, this practice is legal everywhere in Canada. And let me go back to that. New Zealand, Switzerland, Spain, Germany, and Austria, all 6 states in Australia, and 11 states plus DC here. Portugal has recently legalized, although it's not yet in practice, and there is lots of activity out there. Notice that these are all first world countries. These are countries with developed healthcare systems and high standards of living. Now, some other things that we agree about: the US has a set of requirements for eligibility. You have to be adult and competent. You have to be a resident of the state, except for Oregon, Vermont, which permit people from outside. You must be terminally ill. That's defined in all these statutes as expected to die within 6 months. This window is taken essentially from hospice. And you must self-administer, and that is now increasingly interpreted via a gastrointestinal route. That means swallowing a lethal drug mixture. It can be done by peg tube or nasal tube, and also by rectal administration. Anything else is prohibited here. Now, if you look at all these other jurisdictions, none of them, with the very modest exceptions, require terminal illness the way we do. What they do require is intolerable or unbearable suffering, and that's defined in many different ways. You must be adult, although some countries, for instance, the Netherlands and Belgium, permit what is there called euthanasia for cases for children, exceptionally rare. Children do die, and sometimes die in very difficult ways. That requires extensive supervision, also, oversight, also the consent of the parents, and so on. Some of them permit euthanasia in cases of mental illness, the Netherlands and Belgium. These cases are also require heightened scrutiny and are quite rare. Residency is required generally everywhere except for Switzerland. Switzerland is the one country that permits people from abroad and has a rather brisk traffic in people coming from other countries, including this one. There are basically 5 different clinics in Switzerland that will accept people from outside. Under Switzerland's rather more flexible requirements, and all of them permit IV administration. In Australia, it's permitted only if oral administration isn't possible, but this is quite a big difference. In Canada, over 99% of cases are performed using IV administration. So that's the picture globally. There are some other things that we could agree about if we had time. There are some states with low and relatively stable rates. The Netherlands is like that, and that's true here. States with rapid increases, Canada, for instance, but that takes a lot of time. Here's some things we don't agree about quite so well, about language. So people opposed to this practice generally use terms like physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, and mercy killing. And people who favor this practice, legalization of this practice, use terms like death with dignity, physician-assisted dying, or MAiD. That term has come down to us from Canada. In Europe, the term euthanasia is used in the sense of euthanatos, that's Greek, and it means good death. Here, the term euthanasia is used in the sense of Nazi killing, murder of people for whom it is not in any way in their interests. It's motivated on political grounds. So there's some questions we could talk about. Who owns the term dignity, right? The initial uses in this context were the legislation, the Oregon's statute is called death with dignity. And that term was used in some of the early statutes. But then people on the other side of the fence said, wait a minute, That's not dignity. Dignity is avoiding such simplistic solutions. Dignity is maintaining. Well, I'll let Kristen tell you what dignity is, because that's part of this. Ruth Macklin famously said, well, dignity is a useless concept because it is owned by both sides. So you can't actually tell what's the case. So you can see there's lots of ferment in the background. There's some facts, there's some contested things, but let's get to the debate where we really disagree. So over to Kristen.
Thanks, Dr. Battin. Appreciate your comments. I'm just going to go ahead and share my slides here. All right. Okay. All right. Well, thanks to everyone for being here on a Saturday. Thank you to Xavier for inviting me to participate, and to Dr. Battin for participating with me. So the title of our debate is Giving Competent Adults Access to Physician-Assisted Suicide, MAiD, is an appropriate recognition of human dignity and autonomy. So that you clearly know where I stand from the beginning, my response to this statement is a resounding no. Physician-assisted suicide is an affront to human dignity, as it is inherently wrong to aim directly at the death of another human being, especially a vulnerable one afflicted by illness and disability. And as a medical doctor, I lament the introduction of sanctioned killing into the healing profession. Physician-assisted suicide distorts the fundamental practice of medicine. But I also want to be clear in my remarks today that even if the practice of physician-assisted suicide is taken out of the vocation of medicine entirely and given to some kind of death technician, it would still be wrong, as we should never aim directly at ending the life of another member of the human family as a society and be okay with that. So in my short opening remarks, I hope we can think together through this important question. What type of society do we hope to be? Can we be one in which, as a developed, resource-rich country, we resist the temptation to alleviate suffering and alleviate sufferer, which is an impoverished form of healthcare and an impoverished response to suffering? Can we think instead more creatively about how to support our fellow human beings who have life, and life, and hopefully by the end of our time together, we can leave here more hopeful and clear about what's at stake in this debate. And to be clear, what's at stake exactly? Well, an ethos of both our society and a profession, and in which the lives of all of us will become devalued if physician-assisted suicide becomes a law of the land. And as we opened with, Dr. Battin and I disagree on a number of fundamental principles in this debate, and we agree on a lot as well. I think that's the case with so many people who are on the different sides of this issue. All of us care deeply about people who are suffering and who are seriously ill, and we want to have a compassionate response to them. Let me be clear, neither one of us is fighting for the status quo on how we die in this country. We currently don't die well. We both on this. But one response to that is an impoverished response, as killing is wrong, and the other's not. And I don't know what Battin will say today, but I'm sure she'll bring to us some compelling stories. And stories are valuable and they have impact, but this debate and issue can't come down to competing stories or who has the best story. We need to stick to facts and evidence. So I'd like to start with how we disagree about the language used around this topic. If physicians prescribing a medication that, if used as directed, aims to end the life of a member of the human family is not killing, then what is it? If taking steps to deliberately end one's own life is not suicide, then what is it? What do the purveyors of language gain by having us think that this is indeed not killing nor suicide? When we already have a word for something, killing, suicide, and we start to use a whole lot of other words to describe something we already have a word for, I believe this is done with the intention of hiding something. Let me be clear. Assisted dying is a euphemism, which puts one person's role in intentionally ending another's life in a benign or positive light. And this has real consequences for our society, which has always had a stigma around suicide, rightly so, and killing, rightly so. The language used by Dr. Battin today perhaps will also attempt to give an aura of physician-assisted suicide being just like any other medical procedure by using sterile language and even the language of a do-gooder. And this reminds me of the concept of the banality of evil. This concept suggests that evil actions are not necessarily committed by inherently villainous individuals, but rather by people who perpetuate immoral principles without really thinking about the impact on others. Then evil becomes commonplace and is normalized over time. This is often done through a lot of bureaucratic or do-gooder language, and often folks that are part of this sound quite earnest and perhaps soft-hearted, and not what they really are. Part of a systematic attempt to eliminate the weak. But trust me, that's what they're doing. And this should frighten you. And I think here of the prophet Isaiah, who wrote, quote, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, and who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter," end quote. So language does matter. And if we're going to discuss something, let's at least start by telling the truth about what it really is. So once we can agree about what's actually happening, is it morally licit to provide it or to make it legal? Well, I assume that supporters of physician-assisted suicide, like Dr. Battin, would say, you know what? If a person consents and is of their sound mind and comes to this out of a place of exercising their autonomy, then let them have it. They're not hurting anyone else, is what they would say. But the sad reality is that they are hurting other people. Dr. Nicholas Christakis, professor at Yale, has shown that suicide, like other related behaviors, tends to spread from person to person in a social contagion. And the statistically significant influence affects folks for up to 3 degrees of separation. He writes, quote, "Behaviors like suicide, whether assisted or non-assisted, influence the behavior of not only one's friends, but also of one's friends' friends' friends," end quote. You are likely, though, going to hear a lot of talk from Dr. Battin about autonomy. However, I'll remind you that autonomy is a myth. None of us are fully autonomous. And even if we could be, why would we want to be? The beautiful reality is that we are all connected to one another, and the choices we make impact others, as Dr. Christakis' research has shown. And this becomes an inconvenient truth for people like Dr. Battin. But as a society who should care about the other, we should think deeply about how our choices impact those around us, especially the vulnerable other, even if that makes us have to curtail our own personal autonomy in some situations for the common good. And following the truth about how we are connected and the social contagion, studies have shown that the legislation in favor of physician-assisted suicide is associated with an increased number of total suicides, especially for older people and women. This practice creates new victim classes. But I want to be clear, even if it didn't affect other people, it would still be wrong. And again, thinking of how the push for legalization of this, it affects the way we see ourselves and our neighbor. I want to remind you of what writer Susanna Black has said, quote, "The law tells you something about yourself. It used to be obvious that it's not okay to kill another person. But when the authorities of your society say, no, there's nothing about you that would prevent you from killing yourself. Also, we don't need you here. And killing yourself would not do anyone else any harm. You will, if you are a normal person, be affected by that. Because normal people are at least somewhat affected by what the authorities tell them." And for people who think that people who are opposed to physician-assisted suicide are just religious people, this simply isn't true. Many, many groups, including disability groups like Not Dead Yet, are strongly opposed, as they fear that this practice will continue to devalue their lives and put them at risk. Or like our friends at Secular Pro-Life, who say you don't have to be religious to have a problem with killing human beings. And even major medical societies like the AMA are opposed, saying that physician-assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as healer, would be difficult or impossible to control, and would pose serious societal risks. And blocking this practice from coming into more states has been something that both parties have agreed upon, most recently with Democratic Governor of Delaware, as well as many other states across various party lines. Dr. Battin also might claim and use the claim that there has been no slippery slope on this issue. And while I agree that the requirements have remained fairly stable in Oregon, I do not think you can make that claim when you look at other parts of the world, such as Canada, for example, where physician-assisted suicide euthanasia is now the 5th leading cause of death in that country, and has now been posed as a way to treat poverty, disability, homelessness, and non-terminal conditions. And they're euthanizing children now in parts of the world. And just to show you the slippery slope, the number of Canadians dying prematurely from physician-assisted suicide euthanasia has risen 13-fold since legislation. In 2016, when it was legalized in Canada, the number of people dying in that way was about 1,000. And in 2022, the last year for which we have data available, the number was around 13,000. Like, this is the picture of the slippery slope. But I'll remind you, even if there was no slippery slope, physician-assisted suicide euthanasia would still be wrong. Dr. Battin might also say that physician-assisted suicide doesn't disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. However, her own study that looked at this now is almost 2 decades old. Here's the piece from 2007. And strangely, in her analysis of vulnerable older adults, they used 85 years old as the cutoff as its own subgroup to define the elderly instead of 65 years old, which is used actually in almost all other studies looking at older adults. And regarding the claim she likely will make, assisted suicide has not disproportionately affected people with disability, this is not true. According to Canada's own report from their own data in 2022, about 37% of all people who died from assisted suicide required disability services, according to the people who ended their lives. And another 23% had an unknown disability status, which is also an inexcusable oversight. In total, about 200 people required disability supports, but could not access them, according to the same physicians that ended their lives. And arguably, every person who does assisted suicide or euthanasia on the basis of a grievous illness for which there is no good remedy is a person with disability. I'll just remind you of this story when a Paralympian went into the VA hospital in Canada asking for a wheelchair ramp, and they were like, hey, actually, have you considered euthanasia instead? Dr. Battin also might appeal to our emotions today by saying that by declining to use physician-assisted suicide for patients, that we are allowing intolerable suffering. As a medical doctor, I do not in any way discount how people suffer at the end of life. But I'd like to remind our listeners that in the cases of people requesting physician-assisted suicide in Oregon, for example, physical suffering doesn't even make the top reason people request it. They request it for other reasons: fear of being a burden, financial concerns, loss of control, loss of autonomy, etc. Peggy might argue in a way also that make it seem like death itself is some kind of therapeutic, which is part of good palliative medicine. But in this piece that just came out in JAMA Viewpoint by Dr. Chochinov and Finns, they write that, quote, death cannot be titrated or trialed. Hence, it does not qualify as a therapeutic, which means its pursuit resides outside the realm of medicine. They go on to say that, quote, administering a lethal medication does not make it a medical act, albeit healthcare professional involvement and a medical environment provide an air of credibility and legitimacy, end quote. And they call up the wisdom of Paul Ramsey, who reminds us that, quote, physicians must recognize that the function of medicine is not to relieve the human condition of the human condition. Also, the goal supposedly of physician-assisted suicide euthanasia is having people have a controlled, peaceful death. But is that what is even really happening? Well, first of all, the various drug cocktails are experimental in their use, and research suggests that their death actually may not be peaceful at all. This study suggests that the drugs used in doses and combinations have not undergone the same rigor as other medical treatments for safety and efficacy, and that these deaths actually are quite distressing, again, not only for the patients themselves, but for their loved ones. Again, as a physician, I know that a lot of patients don't die well without physician-assisted suicide euthanasia, and even knowing all of this, it's still wrong. Dr. Battin likely also will talk about choice. Let me be clear, we are all for some choices, but we should limit those choices when those choices harm or kill others. And lastly, because we are at the Society of Christian Bioethicists, I have to say that I realize that if Christianity were not true, physician-assisted suicide euthanasia would be easier to accept. If I didn't have the belief in the gospel, then I might too be on Dr. Battin's side, like I once was. If I didn't know that every person is made by God in his image, loved by him, and their life is not our own, then I wouldn't have the horror I have now at this practice, as this practice is an affront to human dignity as it aims directly at the death of one of God's very own image bearers. But I do believe, and therefore know, that physician-assisted suicide euthanasia is an affront to human dignity. If we agree that every human being has inherent dignity and inviolable worth, then it is always wrong to aim at their death. For us to truly affirm inherent human dignity is to say, it is good that you exist. I think in future generations, we'll look back on this and think, how could we have been so unwise? And when we realize something we are doing is wrong, we need to stop. We have systematically made the wrong decision by allowing legislation of physician-assisted suicide in this country. Someone has to say this, and today that person is me. At the core of this issue is a root of despair. We are trying to alleviate despair, but physician-assisted suicide euthanasia is the wrong way to go about doing this. Thank you.
Great.
Let me-
Peggy, I could hand over to you. Thanks very much for the very rich presentation, Kristin. And I think Peggy will go next with opening remarks.
Let me make sure I can get my
Yep.
screen share up, and maybe you can help me, Benjamin, if it is not coming up.
So it'll be the green button at the bottom. It says share screen.
Yeah, I'm not actually seeing it.
Maybe there's another button that has more and 3 dots. Try that one.
Let's see. Sorry, we discussed earlier whether it would make sense to try to. That's not the right button.
Sometimes if you hover your
I would
mouse,
say that I recognize how eloquent Dr. Collier is, but I resist having so many views attributed to me when, in fact, there are many of those views that I do not hold. So let me just keep trying here. Hang on. Here's that. Are you sure I'm authorized to share?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Yeah. Oh, I just don't see why this is not working. If I can't get it to work, then I will just talk through a set of slides here.
So you don't see
I
that.
may have your slides as well, so I could just play them, Peggy, if that would be helpful.
That might, I'd love to be able to get it so I can time it, but let me just see why that is not working. There's Zoom.
Yeah, we had it up and working about 20 minutes ago.
I know it. That's the funny part. So we will, oh, wait, maybe this is it. I think I've got it. Okay, there we go.
Excellent. It's working now.
Perfect.
Good. And let's make it, so slide share. All right, there we go. Sorry. Now you notice that Kristin, I'll just call her informally, slide started with a dark cloud. A clue to her talk. I'm going to start with a brighter view of this by looking at MAiD in Dying's enemies, right? Because I'd list her among them, but there are many, and I assume there are many in this audience. So this is a little trip through the disability rights movement, suicide prevention organizations, and some religious groups, indeed many. So let's just remember what we're talking about. This is the picture of end of life. This is a famous old slide from the hospice physician, Joanne Lynn. And the practice that we're talking about often, oops, I don't know whether you can see this. This cursor, can you see that? In cancer, aid in dying would typically occur somewhere here. It would be requested maybe somewhere here. This is less frequent as um, a diagnosis in aid in dying. And in dementia and frailty, although what's called quality of life is much, or function, is much lower in dementia or frailty. In the US, at least, dementia is not permitted. Remember, it requires a diagnosis of 6 months of terminality. So let's look at each of these and see where these issues contribute, where they agree with aid in dying and what they could contribute to the aid in dying movement, even if that's not their intention. So what about Not Dead Yet, the disability rights movement? Here's what the many of the medical associations said initially. This is around the turn of the century. In fact, the CMA, the British Medical Association, the American Medical Association, they all said the same thing. And it was what led to the view that I and some others did attempt to establish at that time, whether these perceptions were correct. Here's the perceptions of the lives of disabled people are. We certainly are aware of realities of discrimination. Right? But there is no evidence in Canada or Europe, at least at the time Zeke Emanuel was doing this study, that's a while ago, that there are increased rates compared to the general population for people with disabilities. But there is a point that comes from the early feminist literature, and this is about negative perceptions that are internalized. It's hard to fight an enemy who has outposts in your head. And what's drawn from that is the slippery slope concern that Kristin was talking about. So people with disabilities will be more easily led into seeking assisted dying. Well, your life is so difficult. Why would you want to live like this? We know how to relieve your distress, right? So I certainly agree that the enemy may have outposts in your head. We call this social programming. But patients who are dying are already subject to social programming, namely to continue on as long as possible to the very end of their disease. We just heard a lot of this from Dr. Collier. Keep on fighting. You're such a hero. Do it for us. And here's what you see at the end. Let's think about suicide prevention organizations. And disclosure, I've been a career-long member of this organization with a little interruption during the recent Palace Revolution, but it's back on track again. There are different suicide rates in various parts of the world, and many different schools of suicide prevention, right? And they all have the same core commitment, which seems to conflict with aid in dying. Here's the core. Suicide is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for the person. It's a tragedy for the family and other loved ones. And Kristin was making this point quite vocally, for the society as a whole. What kind of society do we want? She said. Here's the goal of one of these groups. And here's one basic suicide prevention strategy. Get the suicidal person to articulate why they are interested in dying. What are their reasons? But also get them to articulate their reasons for living and then reinforce those. It's quite sensible a way of pursuing suicide prevention. And here, suicide prevention, I think, would agree with aid in dying. Choices to die can be misguided, right? Even where it's legal, many requests, and there's data about how frequent this is in the various countries where it's legal, many requests for aid in dying are not honored. Right? But what you can't do, especially where it isn't legal, is exactly what was recommended by that suicide prevention strategy. explore your choice with family or friends or a trained professional. On the contrary, merely saying that you're thinking about suicide or you want to end your life can have these unwanted consequences, including involuntary mental health commitment. Here's where suicide prevention programs could contribute to the aid in dying. And that would be to provide skill to use its experience and skills in helping a person. And remember, this person is already facing death. It's not about, at least in this country, because terminal illness is required, it's not about the difference between dying and not dying. It's about the difference between dying earlier and in what's perceived as an easier way, than later in a way that is not wanted. So skills in thinking a person who's already facing death think through their choices about when and how to die without a commitment to preventing such a choice. Now let's get to the meat. This is the part that's, of course, most relevant to this conference. And by the way, I want to compliment this conference on organizing such a good-sized conference and for putting it online and with no registration fee. That's fabulous. Congratulations to the organizers. But let's get to the point here. Some religious groups are opposed strongly to euthanasia and aid in dying. And it'd be easy to dismiss this because it's opposed to so many other activities: divorce, abortion, IVF, stem cell research, same-sex relationships and marriage, and why not just write this off if you don't quite buy their other views here. But I think there is something important to be gained from the church's opposition, and in particular the Catholic Church's opposition. So let's see what it is. This is Pope Francis. He denounces this right to die kind of legislation. It's a sin against God. There's a false sense of compassion. To think of it as dignity, it's a symptom of a throwaway culture. It's a threat to families everywhere. Many of these points are similar to or identical to the ones that Kristin has already made. And life starts at the moment of conception and should end at the moment of natural death, right? To do otherwise, euthanasia is playing with life. It's a sin against the Creator. So the church's objections, of course, are complex. They're conceptual, they're empirical, slippery slope arguments, and theological ones that have blocked right to die legislation. Here's one result. This is Paris a while ago, is France. The French government rejected euthanasia, but approved terminal sedation. That's its answer to this question. Are there alternatives to aid in dying? Here are some of the things we do permit. Terminal sedation used to alleviate intractable suffering. There are some of the figures about what happens or may happen at the end of life. VSED is a new darling, voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. This does require careful management, particularly control of severe thirst. The patient eventually dies of dehydration. This is often recommended, indeed, by physicians and others in jurisdictions where actual medical aid in dying is not legal. Francis's view of the appropriate alternative to aid in dying is, at least in part, this: time spent with the sick is holy time. I wouldn't disagree with that, right? You serve those who are sick, be with them in their suffering, going forth from yourself to help others. So showing solidarity with the sick while not judging why they are sick. That's a reference to AIDS, right? None of this is precluded by aid in dying. It's important to see what there is in this, I guess we have to call it Christian message, that would be precluded by aid in dying. None of that. But let's see what might be precluded. So let's jump back a couple of centuries, in fact, to probably the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. late medieval times. And think about the practice of ars moriendi. This is in the wake of the Black Death, and there are a number of works that come out. They involve consolation for the dying man and discussion of the 5 temptations to avoid. They counsel dying well, gladly, and willingly. They also pose questions that also insist that questions be put to the dying man. These must be asked and answered truthfully. One of these texts said, or the person cannot be saved. And what's central for the dying man is contrition, repentance, and absolution. Here's the prayer as it has been. Obtain for us at the hour of our death perfect sorrow, that's repentance. Sincere contrition, well, that's repentance, right? First is recognition of one's sinfulness. Repentance, the pardon and remission of our sins, a worthy receiving of the Holy Viaticum. You saw it in that visual of the dying man being anointed with holy oil. And the comfort of the sacrament of extreme unction, it's no longer called that. And here's the kicker: in order that we may appear with greater security before the throne of the just, but merciful Judge, our God and our Redeemer. So look at the parts of that and consider it in relation to the way we die. Here are points of agreement between these teachings, these medieval teachings of the church, still active, and aid in dying. Last moments are important. Communication is important. Acceptance of oncoming death is important. And especially spiritual experience is important. But what's precluded by intolerable suffering at the end of life or by pain-relieving medication that dull consciousness? Here's a description that, let me read it from something that has just come in from a, oops, looks like I lost it, let me find it. From a colleague who is, no, too many things here. I think I've lost it. It's about, this is from a hospice physician describing the way in which various medications for the relief of symptoms and including pain at the end of life work to dull consciousness or to sedate the person and are increased in time with the need to increase control of these things and they produce greater sleepiness until the person becomes largely sleepy, and when finally becomes fully sedated, it will be essentially, because you can't oral feed and won't tube feed someone who is sedated, will die, usually within a week or two. So here's what's precluded by these practices that are part of our current world: self-awareness, communication, the capacity for bestowing wisdom. This is an Old Testament notion of the patriarch bestowing blessings on his family, his culture, his everything. Saying goodbye, the capacity to meet, even embrace death, perhaps as the transition to another life, and in particular, the ability to pray. You can't pray if you are sedated. In medieval Christianity, at least, the last moments of life are the crucial moments. This is the opportunity for repentance and absolution. And this is what may determine the entire course of one's afterlife. In contemporary secular version is life closure, but of course this is a different thing. Life closure also requires alertness. Here's what one study in progress found. According to one study in progress, what the families of patients who died in the ICU most often regret is not having known that death was coming, although the medical staff did, and hence not having been able to say goodbye. Right? This is the kind of situation that we often put ourselves and our loved ones in. Here's again what may be happening at the end of life. This is 1,000 miles away from what the medieval consciousness would have wanted. So I think that if we look at the teachings of the Catholic Church, even its medieval view here, what we can gain from understanding this religious consciousness is a deep sense of the spiritual importance of the end of life for the person, for the family, and for the larger society in general. Kristin did mention, of course, the impact of medical aid in dying and the importance of it for the larger society in general. She took it to be negative. I wouldn't agree with that, but I do think and agree with her that the importance of how we die for the larger society in general is central. So what can the enemies of aid in dying contribute to the Right to Die movement? They all intend to make human life better, and they all could help to make human death better too, right? From disability rights, we get alertness to social programming in one direction or the other. It's not just one, it's the hang on, do it for us, right? You don't have any right to control the end of your life. That's also social programming. From suicide prevention, skill in helping a person think through their own choices about whether and when and how to die without antecedent commitment to preventing or stifling their choice. And from religious groups, as we just saw, a deep sense of the spiritual importance of the end of life for the person, the family, and perhaps for society in general. All of these would enrich the Right to Die movement, and to some extent already do. Maybe they don't need to be seen as entirely enemies after all. And I think there's a lot in the supposed enemies of medical aid in dying, of euthanasia, that is compatible with the way medical aid in dying can be viewed as a favorable alternative for people whose choice that is. We don't have to be enemies, even if that's what they have in mind. So thanks, that's it. Let's see where we go from here.
Thanks very much, Peggy, for that rich, another rich presentation. I think kind of like really interesting angle as well. So I think we're going to have an opportunity for both speakers.
Yeah.
What was that? Sorry, you go.
I know I've been invited as the bad guy here to defend medical aid in dying and euthanasia.
Yeah, well, I think one thing I'd say is I've been edified by the way in which the two speakers today, yourself and Kristin, have approached this debate, and I think it's a kind of a good example of and hopefully with the Q&A, it's a good opportunity for me to flag this, like that we want this to be robust but also respectful. I think we've done that so far, so that's fantastic, and I think much more that can be said of a lot of debates. So but I wanted to give you both the opportunity to respond to each other's presentations, because I think, I mean, as can happen in debates, there'll be questions and comments and concerns that either I'm sure either presenter will have about the other's presentation. So did we have a particular, Kristin, would you like to go, or Peggy, were you going to go first? I can't remember whether we had arranged
well,
this.
I think it might as well have a first turn, and then I've got a couple of
great
to show.
Perfect.
All right, great. Yeah, and actually, for those of you who are watching from home, actually, Peggy and I, well, I really like you. We really like each other, I think. We've had the opportunity to meet actually in St. Louis at ASBH a few weeks ago. So that was such a joy. So it's really fun to be able to talk with you now and in between conversations we've had. So this has been super fun. All right, I was just writing some things down fiercely. So thanks for your remarks, Peggy. I just want to say that part of me, to be honest, is shocked and confused actually that we're even debating this topic. It's like if I were to wake up from some nightmare and tell my husband, you won't believe this, like I had this nightmare that we were living in a society where we thought it was okay to be killed or kill someone else, and I had to defend against that, to be honest. But here we are. But in a country where we already kill perfectly healthy babies in utero, then it's not hard to imagine that we now are at the point where we want to kill sick older persons. So I guess I'd just like to react to the title of your slide, that you're outlining the enemies of physician-assisted suicide. I note how you chose to frame your remarks, like talking about, who you're against or who's against the movement, and not really as much about what you're for. Like you're supposedly for the wonderful, good procedure of physician-assisted suicide, instead of talking about really so much of the virtues of that act, talked more about the groups that are against it, calling us enemies. And I guess you said, right, I'm one of those enemies. And you know what, I'm okay with that. C.S. Lewis states that we as Christians are living in enemy-occupied territory. He says something like, Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed. You might say landed in disguise, and is calling us all to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. And that's what I'm here to do, to be honest, to sabotage efforts at entangling the sacred vocation of medicine with the business of death, and to resist laws that are an affront to human dignity. So Peggy, I enthusiastically accept your label of me as enemy. I would also like to react to maybe those death curves. I saw those death curves when I listened to your TED Talk a few weeks ago as well. And, while I agree that while our life expectancy is different than hundreds of years ago, and that most US Americans are going to die from a chronic incurable illness, I'm not sure that way of dying has to be worse than the dying that used to happen suddenly. It's almost like, again, we can talk about this, like you're plotting good death, like totally plots with minimal suffering and maximum control, right? And, bad death tracks with like no control and minimal suffering. And I'm not sure that that's totally true. I think there's some nuance there. So I wonder if that's something that you would agree with. I think there's maybe some assumption in those slides with the curves that dying suddenly and swiftly is better than having this long time to die. And I'm so glad you brought up actually the Ars Moriendi, which for those of you, again, that maybe just turned on, it's a Latin text from the 15th century that offered guidance on how to die well in the Christian tradition. So in that time, right, dying in your sleep quickly would have been the most dreaded way to die, as you said, as you wouldn't have time for last rites or to ponder your own mortality and what that means, and even to prepare for your death. And I really appreciate your pictures that are so compelling of the people on the machines. And I think I started with this. I agree, we do not die well in this country. But then the response to that is like not kill our patients, right? It's almost like saying, which I agree, we think we all can agree that maternal health outcomes in this country are terrible, but that shouldn't lead us to kill babies in utero. Like, let's do better for maternal health outcomes. Like, let's do better for people who are dying. I also, I know it's hard in the nuance of slides to talk about this, but almost the slide, I agree, while, deep sedation precludes us from being able to pray and prepare for our death, I'm not sure that suffering, even severe suffering, actually can't lead to a growing of wisdom. Xavier just wrote on this actually about flourishing at the end of life and what gifts can come from that, and our ability to pray. And then lastly, I just maybe would like to react to your slides that discuss the Catholic Church's opposition to physician-assisted suicide euthanasia. I'm not Catholic, in full disclosure, but as a Christian person, I feel like I might be able to respond here. So you said that because the Catholic Church is against practices that harm others, let's be clear, right? Divorce, IVF, abortion, that we, quote, may be tempted to write off the church's view here on this issue of physician-assisted suicide. And I guess my question is, why might folks be tempted to write off the views of the church on these issues due to their stance on the other issues, like the church's wavering commitment to standing up for life against the forces of consumerism and ableism, racism, ageism in the market, instead should be a witness and compel others to resist the sanctioned violence that is also within physician-assisted suicide euthanasia. I would say, if anything, we as Christians are being internally consistent on this matter. Unlike, in my opinion, someone who is against suicide in some contexts, but not against suicide in some other context. Like calling a suicide hotline and saying, "Hi, I'm suicidal," and then getting a response, "Have you considered suicide?" is wildly incoherent and is what makes me actually want to write off your views, perhaps, to be honest. And the fact that you think that Catholic doctrine can align in any way with physician-assisted suicide shows, I think, how maybe you, in my humble opinion, that you wildly misunderstand actually what Christianity stands for and is about. I hope we can have more offline conversations about this. And for example, just the prayer that, just to close my rebuttal, the prayer that you showed at the end, asking, like, "Do not forsake us at the hour of our death." You know, to forsake, as you know, means to abandon. And I can think of no more grievous patient abandonment than for me to kill my own patient and force them out of existence. So I look forward to our conversation.
Great. Well, we
Great.
certainly have plenty to talk about. And again, I will try to show you a few remarks. I must say, there's a lot that we agree about here. Oh, for heaven's sakes, why? Okay. The first thing I'd like to say, Kristin, to you is that I agree with you. Neither one of us is in favor of the status quo. We all think we can do better. I disagree about your use of the universal opposition to killing. This is not a personal remark, but about a tradition of our societies. Traditionally, there were three situations in which killing was defensible: just war, self-defense, and the defense of innocent others. And we still recognize all of those in our legal systems. As for suicide, what you label suicide, and that term comes with negative connotations. Let me just try a little thought experiment on you. What do we call a person who straps a bomb to his chest? This is a slightly dated and somewhat biased example. A guy who straps a bomb to his chest and walks into a crowded market. What do we call him? Everybody will call him a suicide bomber. What do we call a guy who, in our army, falls on a grenade to save his buddy? Okay. What do we call him? Everyone in this office, in this culture, will call him a hero. These two men died of the same injury, explosion to the chest, and they both did so willingly and knowingly. Yet one of them, we use the negative label suicide, and the other one we call a hero. You would not dream of calling him a suicide. So that's about slippery language, and it would want me to say to you that to insist that killing is always wrong, and that the practice we're talking about is killing, is, I think, leaden. That is, it doesn't recognize the very great differences in mechanics of death and the intention under which such things happen. And after all, in this country and in many others, including Switzerland, Australia, it is not the doctor who kills the patient. The patient must legally self-administer. The doctor may provide the prescription. In Switzerland, for instance, the doctor may set up an IV, but the patient must trip the plunger on the valve on the bag that dispenses the euthanaticum. The patient has to do that himself. So you can't call that killing. If you're going to be literalist about it, you might call it suicide. Every single statute in this country denies flatly and explicitly that this is suicide or euthanasia, or they have a little bit of variation, but all of them say that expressly. It's not suicide. It's not killing. It's not mercy killing. It's something else. And I think we need to think that through. Now, here are a couple of things, if I can get again to show you, with which I had so much trouble before, but let's see. Well, let's share this screen. And here is what I'd like to show you now. Just a couple of little slides. These are responses to you, Kristin. And the first is, there are just a couple of these. You said that this is opinion 5.7. This is true from the AMA, the American Medical Association. And that 5.7 holds that physician-assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as healer. It would be difficult or impossible to control and would pose serious societal risks, right? That opinion does say that. However, that's opinion 5.7. CJA, the AMA's Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs, in 2019, reviewing this tension, talks about the irreducible moral tensions in stake for physicians with respect to participating in assisted suicide. It elected to continue this tension. Tensions evidenced within its own code of medical ethics, right? For some physicians, the sacredness of ministering to a terminally ill or dying patient and the duty not to abandon the patient precludes the possibility of supporting patients in hastening their own death. But for others, and here's where CJA's policy is in tension, this is the AMA, not to provide a prescription for lethal medication in response to a patient's sincere request violates that same commitment and duty, right? Both, and it recognizes that both views are the views of thoughtful, morally admirable individuals. They are equally deeply held and well-considered perspectives. So it then formulates, there's a second opinion, preserving the this is the one that Kristin quoted. Here is the other one, preserving the opportunity of physicians to act or refrain from acting in accordance with the dictates of conscience in their professional practice. And you can read the rest of it. This is you mentioned the governor of Delaware who recently vetoed something that a medical aid in dying bill that had passed through the legislature and was on his desk, right? He quoted opinion 5.7. He did not recognize opinion 1.17. Physicians should have considerable latitude to practice in accord with well-considered, deeply held beliefs that are central to their self-identities. This would, were I a physician, this would be, I think, true of me, well-considered and deeply held belief that this practice is just, decent, and ultimately fully respectful of patients and their various choices. It's important to remember that this practice is rare. In Oregon, it has been about 5 5/10 of a percent of the annual mortality. In the Netherlands, it's been about 5%. It's up a little bit, 5% of the people who die in a given year die in this way, even though it's legal and widely known to be so. This isn't frequent, but it is really important. Anyway, physicians who do provide assistance in dying and those who do not, that's both of us, both sides that we're talking about, are understood to be acting in keeping with the provisions of the code. Wow, the AMA on the fence, isn't that great? Let's see. About disabled people being concerned about that. There is data, I didn't manage to look it all up, but there are plenty of disabled people and disability organizations whose response is, look, we die too. Every single one of us eventually dies. We should be able to have as much choice in the matter of dying as any other person. What about the Dutch expanding euthanasia to children aged to 1? They already permit decisions for newborns from 0 to 1. That's called the Groningen Protocol. But to say it expands euthanasia to children ages 1 to 12 it looks as though any kid can stand up and say, "Mommy, I want this." That is so far from the truth and is so disrespectful to the Dutch in general. This is an agonizing choice for when a child is already subject to a condition from which it cannot survive. And these decisions are made not just by one doc, they are made by a committee that requires heightened scrutiny. And it is just misleading to suggest that this is another game for children. Let's see what else we have here. This is a misleading slide, I think, in that it suggests that these are the number of deaths from suicide. Notice that the number of deaths from suicide is actually, according to this slide, going down, not up. That's assuming that suicide and medical aid in dying are not the same thing. Medical aid in dying is going up. It only becomes legal in the first place here, and that's reportable. And indeed, it's going up. But to claim that this is a number of suicides, you can say intentional self-deaths, but that suggests that somehow all of these are illicit and legally opposable. No, suicides in the usual sense are going down. Isn't that extraordinary? I also didn't manage to look at this. There's great data from the Netherlands about assisted deaths. The grieving process after medical aid in dying, or as the Dutch call it, euthanasia, is understood in various studies to be less severe for patients whose loved ones have died in this way. And that's partly because they don't see the person as subject to a physical process that can't be controlled. They see their loved one as having made a choice that they respect and that incorporates their loved one's own choice about how they want their death to go. Sorry, I'd be happy to hunt that all up, but I can't do it right now, of course. Anyway, let's go back to time for us to talk now.
Yep. So now I think next were we going to have a kind of a free-flowing exchange, or did you want to, we could go to Q&A with the audience?